In theory, all different kinds of ideologues, sermonizers, and thinkers are consistent in their worldview. They are consistent in the way that they critique different ideologies and ways of thinking which are not in agreement with their own school of thought, so to speak. In reality, this does not always translate. In many cases, you get the consideration or the fact that you will have people belonging to a certain school of thought who focus their criticisms and attacks on one school of thought that doesn't agree with them, but they are totally silent or omit criticisms or downplay criticisms of another school of thought or another way of thinking. This is the concept that I would term compensatory criticisms. In other words, you overcompensate for your lack of criticism for one ideology, one school of thought, without criticizing or whilst ignoring the very valid criticisms from your own way of thinking that should be directed to another way of thinking or school of thought as well. Of course, given the nature of this idea and how it would apply to a lot of politics, a lot of political discourse, and a lot of religious discourse, and a lot of philosophical discourse, it may be a slightly sensitive topic, but it certainly is a reality that occurs. And we see many political thinkers, political ideologues, religious sermonizers engage in this kind of overcompensatory criticism where they will only critique one side or they'll only critique a certain group, but not critique another group which, from their worldview, are deserving of said criticism as well. One example that I can give, which I can personally relate to because I am from this background, although I've been brought up and I grew up in the West, is the discourse or the conflict between India and Pakistan, let's say. India and Pakistan are both culturally very similar. It's very funny then that these very culturally similar people disagree so vehemently with one another. On one end, you've got brown Muslims. On the other end, you've got predominantly brown Hindus. And what happens oftentimes is they're so critical of each other that they go to the extent of having a weird affinity and kind of sucking up to other groups who are more discriminatory towards them and probably just as prejudiced towards them as they are to each other. So, for example, you see this weird phenomena: Muslims from originally from Pakistan or the subcontinent and Hindus from the subcontinent who will suck up to, quite frankly, white supremacist talking points or white supremacist groups. And I'm not just talking about white nationalist content or just normal right-wing content. That, of course, is a whole other thing in and of itself, of certain Indians and Pakistanis cosplaying as white nationalists online and right-wingers online. That's a whole other topic. But there have been examples of Pakistanis and Indians sort of playing up the role of a white supremacist, even cosplaying as a white supremacist online because of the fact that they hate each other so much. And how that works out is that it gives them a channel, it gives them an avenue to release all of their hatred for one another. So a Pakistani cosplaying as a white supremacist takes his anger out on Hindus and Jews, and a Hindu cosplaying as a white supremacist takes all his anger out on Muslims and Arabs and people belonging to the Islamic faith more broadly. And the irony in both of these cases is that they have this kind of weird self-hating inferiority complex. They're cosplaying as this kind of white supremacist character online. The irony of ironies is that an actual white supremacist would hate both the brown Muslim and the brown Hindu. So really and truly, it would make more sense if the Indian and Pakistani, no matter how much they may not like each other, if they both directed their criticisms at things like white nationalism and, even more extreme than white nationalism, white supremacy itself, and attitudes of prejudice and discrimination against brown peoples more generally and Muslims and Hindus more specifically. So the irony is that they both should agree on this one point, and yet inevitably they both in certain online spaces cosplay as that very thing to channel their hatred of one another. It's just the irony of ironies there. Another example you can see is oftentimes in religious discourse or when it comes to certain topics of religion, you've got some people who aren't consistent in their criticisms of religions. For example, you will notice in certain leftist circles, perhaps in certain circles amongst the left, that they're very vocal about, let's say, Christianity and the history of Christianity, how it's led to oppression, for example. In certain right wing circles, you've got issues with Islam, right? With people criticizing Islam and people criticizing certain practices associated with Islam. So on the left, you've got attacks associated with Christianity nominally, and on the right, you've got attacks with things associated with Islam nominally. Of course, the more you get to the extreme of the right, the far right, you'll get attacks on Jewish people, on Jews, on Judaism. But the irony is that if you're going to critique religion, if you're going to critique one religion, you're not very consistent in these criticisms. So, for example, you will notice that the Christian, let's say the right wing Christian archetype, who will criticize Islam, isn't very consistent, because in many cases, the things that he criticizes Islam for can be found within the Old Testament, the New Testament, and within the broader Christian tradition and within Christian history as well. And you'll often find people on the left who may not be so vocal in criticisms of other religions, of practices found within other religious traditions or practices associated with other religious traditions, but they will still attack Christianity specifically. Or, for example, people who attack Jews specifically and just blame everything on Jews. It's a very immature mindset, first of all, to just scapegoat one group, not to mention how prejudiced it is, but it also ignores the incredible contributions that Jews have made to the world. Jews have contributed to the sciences, the social sciences, the natural sciences, and you're just going to ignore all of the good things about the Jewish tradition, and you're just going to start scapegoating the Jews. The reality is that in many cases, criticism of religion often isn't done from a consistent, objective, moral, or philosophical framework, which leads to its own self problems. But more importantly, in many cases, they take certain problematic things that they find in certain religious traditions and make that the be all and end all of their criticism. They ignore the context that goes behind certain problematic things within those traditions, or they ignore the various explanations that scholars within those said religious traditions have given to explain those things and to try and understand them better. And furthermore, they will often not be consistent with these criticisms, so that they would apply them to, in theory, all different religions that they would disagree with, but they specifically apply to only one religion that suits their dogma. And so it's very unfair in that regard. In reality, of course, all religious traditions have incredible teachings about humanity and the power of faith. And if there are problematic things within those religious traditions, in many cases there's context behind them, and they can very easily be explained according to said religious scholarship. And so it'd be rather unfair to be very inconsistent in these criticisms. It's not to say that people can't criticize these religions or these religious traditions per se. That's not all I'm saying. People are well within their right to disagree with religion or political ideologies. But it's just the case that you may critique one religion, but you completely ignore all the other religions, or even your own religion that has the very same teachings. And it just becomes very redundant, and just generally overall, it becomes very repetitive when people are just critical of one thing specifically, or people are just criticizing one set of ideas specifically, but when it comes to another set of ideas, they completely ignore any criticism of that, and then they have to just compensate for their lack of criticism for that idea by overly criticizing another idea. It just makes discourse way more toxic than it should be, and it doesn't allow for any consistency within that criticizes worldview, and it just prevents an objective, neutral, unpartisan, unbiased discussion about the truth of the matter entirely.